Hey everyone, welcome to Source, the Rethink Mining podcast. We're going to explore mining, its innovation, and transformation in the industry that's going to drive our world forward. I'm Carl, I'm your host, and the Executive Director and CEO of Rethink Mining. What we're going to do with this podcast is meet some really interesting people, talk about the industry, talk about innovations, talk about new technology, and explore what's actually possible and what we can do collectively to create the minerals and metals that are necessary to drive our world forward. I hope you join us. You know, one of the things at Rethink Mining that is really important for us and that we're running into all the time, we do consortia, we do co-development technology, we work with startups and SMEs and OEMs and mining companies, and intellectual property always comes up. And in previous lifetimes of also, people say intellectual property is the problem. It's a barrier versus an enabler. So today we're really lucky that we've got Anthony de Fazekas with us here today, who is really legal counsel with Mintz and basically works with startups, works with the universities, works with companies in multiple industries. Anthony, I don't mean to fawn over you, but if somebody asks who's Anthony, I say he's one of the top IP minds in Canada, is what I say. That's my interpretation. So I'm really fortunate to have your acquaintance and for you to be on our board of directors as well. But also the fact that you have mentored, what is it? NORCAT, Mars DD. You teach IP. You work with a lot of startups and other industries. So we're really lucky to have you here today to talk about everything about IP. And sure. We'll see where it goes. So Anthony, because I probably can't introduce you and do you justice, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, happy to, Carl, and happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So I've been practicing intellectual property for almost 25 years, but very early on, I realized that companies, whether they're big or small, they need a bit more of a strategic approach to intellectual property. So it's great to talk about patents, trademarks, formal intellectual property, but that doesn't really capture the intangible value effectively in every case. And so what companies need help with even more than making sure that if they're investing in a patent, it's one that's going to be enforceable. It's one that actually focuses on the differentiation, the market differentiation of the company. They need somebody to really step in and really provide them some guideposts on how they should be thinking about intellectual property in the longer term. And even more importantly than that, what are the processes that they need to build out as a company across their various stages? So what a startup needs to focus on, and then what they need to ratchet up as they scale, either from a commercialization point of view, a revenue point of view. It's pretty nuanced. So that's typically what I do across industries, and I've been doing that strategy part for a long time, and I love it because it's always changing. Every company's different. Every technology area is different, and mining is an exciting area. I mean, particularly in Canada, I feel it's an exciting area. So that's basically what I do.
And you also work on the intellectual property side and on a collaborative side in consortia where IP and tech development's done in multiple industries, that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you step back from intellectual property and think about it in terms of intangible value, right? It becomes pretty clear that how companies harness their intangible value and how they monetize it, it's not just going to be about filing patents or identifying their trade secrets. It's very much going to be about contracts, like from the get-go. And I think mining is a really good example of this. I think across industries, we see that innovative companies, they need to validate their technology by working with larger companies. But in mining, that is almost always the case. And so that's going to be about collaboration agreements. It's going to be about consortium agreements. And mining, I think, is quite unique to a certain extent because there's more of a culture of intercompany collaboration than is typically the case. I mean, we see it in all industries, but those types of intercompany collaborations, even where folks who are quasi-competitors perhaps in some areas, but they still are collaborating on early stage technology. That's very much part of the DNA of the mining industry, which is quite exciting because you got to, as you know, you have to sort through a lot of issues in order to make sure that those collaborations are going to be win-win-win collaborations.
And in some respects, use DNA as an analogy. That triple helix can be a little more complicated when dealing with some of these things. So something I've run into and I've come to realize, and I think a few other people in the mining industry I've talked to as well, is that in some cases, whether it's startups or governments or nonprofit people, there's confusion about IP. Like when people talk about IP, right? They talk about IP, IPR, commercial rights. It's all IP, but it's not. People do not, in some cases, do not understand the differences between those three things. And there's probably more. I'm not the expert. Can you guide us through what is the difference and how important it is at every stage of these three assets when you're working with others or as a startup or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I think the best way of thinking about it is that the assets themselves are this big asset class of intangible assets to start with, right? And I think it's almost the confusion. I think it comes almost from the fact that we're mixing different ways of looking at intangible value and monetizing that intangible value. So, I think part of what ends up happening is that many companies kind of focus on particular types of intellectual property rather than realizing that intellectual property is really about having the right mix of different rights for the right time for the company, given its go-to-market strategy, given a whole bunch of different factors. And so a lot of times what I find is that companies tend to skip to, okay, I have this patentable technology, but they haven't really done a full spectrum type review or inventory of what it is that they actually have from an intangible value. And the starting point really is that most companies, and some mining companies may be a bit of an exception to this, but most companies these days, 90 to 95% of their value is actually in intangible assets. But those intangible assets could be applied know-how. It could be the expertise of the company in testing technology, the expertise related to running collaborations. And those are things that we don't always think about. We don't always document. We don't track. And things that you don't track, you can't really protect. And more importantly, you can't make money out of it if you're not tracking it. So I think really the starting point is to make sure that you have this complete inventory, you're updating it often. And then how it is that you protect it, it's going to be a mixture of tools, and some of that really is going to be contracts. Some of it may be patents. But I think what's really essential is the protection mechanisms are about making money out of these assets, making sure that you have the appropriate ownership, control, rights to use. And once you talk about it in terms of control or rights to use, you realize we're not just talking about patents. We're talking about data governance, because some of the most valuable assets are data assets. And so it may very well be that better data governance is the best investment the company can make in terms of really making sure that it is ready to monetize its intangible assets than, say, for example, patents. So the mix is going to be different for every company. I think the key message is that, and it's great to see this in the news recently. A lot of folks are talking about IP strategy in Canada, but in other jurisdictions as well, more recently. Whereas 5-6 years ago, not many people really focused on it. And I would say that it's very clear that every company that really wants to generate revenue by monetizing its intangible assets, and that can be often the most profitable part of a business, that's not their core business, but they realize it is part of their core business over time, it can really boost the profitability of the business. And so every company ultimately has to have an IP strategy, whether they develop it on their own or with outside help. It's really critical. And I think it's also important that these strategies be ambitious. You have to budget. You have to have different versions of your IP strategy based on, variables, let's say. But on the other hand, when it comes to attracting investment and ultimately guaranteeing the success of the company, you don't start with sort of a plan that's really about just checking off a mark. When your business is really about capturing and monetizing these assets, you do have to be ambitious. And I think that's an area where, Canada has been lacking. It's been shown a number of times.
Recent articles.
Some recent articles. Although I have to say mining is interesting from this point of view too, because there are some studies that show that when we look at the total mining innovation in Canada, patents, while it's not the only form of protection, it's a proxy though for, are we innovating? Are we protecting our innovation? And actually the mining sector in Canada performs relatively well. There's some gaps in the ecosystem, perhaps. Like we have OEMs, but maybe not as high a concentration as some other countries. But if you look at the relative concentration of Canada in the mining sector, and you look at the innovation, and you look at the IP performance, if you will, it's actually a bit better in mining than in other sectors.
Well, that's interesting because some of the recent articles say exactly the opposite.
Well, I mean, there's going to be gaps, right?
Yeah,
So I think the recent article that you're referring to is talking about, there's some gaps where there was substantial innovation, and then comparatively speaking, in that case, one can argue that some competing companies were able to essentially occupy the commercial opportunity by being faster or more aggressive to patent, right? And so there are going to be these stories, but when you look at the sector as a whole, WIPO published a study in 2019 where, every time I read one of those reports, I think to myself, oh, how is Canada going to fare this report around innovation? And actually, it's not a dismal performance. Let's put it that way.
Well, and also too, I just want to close this off on the article you mentioned, the data that was actually, as you said, it didn't cover the whole industry. It covered mining company performance, but then you could make the argument: should a mining company have a IP portfolio if they're not developing tech, they're rather using the technology? So there's a whole argument about is a mining company a tech company versus something else. And that comparison, I read that comparison. I'm not quite sure about that. It's skewed a bit because it's comparing a mining company versus a tech company that's producing widgets they're selling as a commodity. And it's not a fair comparison. I don't think so. But it's nice that you mentioned the WIPO report in 2019. We were actually... there's a chapter in there about innovation in mining, and I don't know if it was 2019 report. I was actually at the release of it. It was a book about intellectual property and mining, and Rethink Mining was actually in there about open innovation, how you do co-development, how we change, how we do this to fast track innovation. So it was really cool to be involved in that, which is globally versus just Canadian. But I wanted to go back to a couple of quick things. Is the key piece about intellectual property? It's intangible, number one, but number two, it's not just a patent or a mark or a copyright or a trademark. There's this other stuff like the know-how, data. I wrote data down because it's probably becoming more and more important as something you could market and sell, and can get you in trouble as well if you're not looking at it properly. And data governance. We talked earlier about, if you're storing data, warehouse data, a software startup or whatever else, you've got to think about jurisdiction, like the Patriot Act in the US. And you got to think about all this stuff. It's not just, here's my tech and I'm going to patent how I'm going to build this coffee mug. It's more than that. Mm-hmm. So it's the intangible asset. The one question I had about the IP and the value of IP, is it a fair statement? And again, I don't know this, but is it a fair statement? Because the IP it's basically, here's the device or the widget or whatever it is we're going to build, right? That's in a nutshell. Is it fair to say that the value of intellectual property as it stands when it has not been commercialized is negligible? I'm kind of curious because you can value IP different ways, right? And the reason I ask that is because people I've talked to people who said, I've got this really cool idea, we've protected it, our value is $100 million. Well, how do you do that? It's a tricky thing. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, valuation of intellectual property is just as tricky as valuation of businesses.
Yes,
right? Yeah. It's really no different. But and ultimately, I think some of these valuations, they're notional.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're confirmed when there's commercialization, actual revenue coming in the door, and other times it turns out that some of the assumptions were incorrect. Yeah. So it's tough. I mean, we still valuation is still a really important barometer of how you're building value over time, especially. But it's a difficult analysis for sure. But I think when you are able to look at the industry and you're able to point to similar technologies and their trajectory when it came to commercialization, generation of revenue, relative profitability, and so on and so forth, then you could draw comparisons that tend to hold.
So a comparable sort of approach.
Yeah. I think that's probably the way to do it. And in mining in particular, because of the focus of innovation to a certain extent on reduction of cost, but also sustainability, those being sort of probably two of the big drivers in the industry, I would argue that if you can make a direct link between your technology and some of those changes in performance in mining, then you probably it may be an easier to value set of intangible rights, possibly, right?
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah, possibly.
Well, as you said at the start, Anthony, it's nominal or notional to start because you don't know where it's going to end up. You've got to start somewhere.
Right. But I would say that apart from valuation, I think the clearer sort of data sets that we can look at in relation to protection of intangibles in mining innovation, but this kind of crosses all industries, is that patents and assets such as patents, trademarks, industrial designs, copyright, et cetera, they are all forms of formalization of intangible assets. Once they're captured in those legal rights, that they're not going to be lost. They're not going to dissipate. So when you look at companies and their intangible value, and then you map their processes for identifying and harnessing them, documenting them, you realize that what ends up happening in lots of businesses is that they're innovating, but they're losing that value, whether it's employees leaving or somebody came up with an idea that it didn't seem relevant at first and it just went into a black hole. And then 2-3 years later, the market has changed or something else has changed from a technological point of view. And actually that was a valuable insight, but it's gone, right? So in a sense, the starting point from a value building point of view is making sure that there's investment in these internal processes, right? So a lot of times people talk about, well, patents are expensive. Enforcing patents are even more expensive, and sure they are. but good housekeeping and internal education around a key function of the business is actually not expensive compared to the value that you can create, compared to the downstream revenue you can generate. So those processes are really an area where many companies don't focus enough. And they overestimate, I think, the difficulty and the costs associated with improving. And then when you look at very successful businesses, it's not just that they have maybe larger patent portfolios, but when you look inside of them, and I've had the privilege to see how lots of different companies approach this, and and you can translate that from a best practices point of view to other companies and other industries, but you realize that how they organize themselves internally around prioritizing the collection of these assets is really critical, because at the end of the day, once there is demand in the marketplace, it really is about knowledge transfer. So it's about you're selling a bundle of rights, and the exclusivity provided, for example, by patents is really important. But if you don't have that bundle of applied know-how, and if you don't know how to translate that into another business, and you haven't really thought about that piece, and maybe it's technical education for your customers and so on, you're not really going to find customers. And more importantly, if you do a really good job around that, then you can charge a premium. So it's all of these different dimensions of intangible value working together with a commercial strategy that kind of reaches over it. That's really key.
And you said a couple of things that are really important there, Anthony. One is, as you said, the business may not just be about the widget and selling the widget. It could be, as you said, the know-how that can set up another revenue stream, another business line. You could even do spin-off businesses. It's about the data, depending on what the technology is. You could commercialize that, the know all that sort of stuff. You could actually generate several revenue streams based on your IP strategy, not just a patent, right? But the other thing you said too was people look at and you've run into that with us, the cost of patents, right? But the way I look at it, and again, I don't know what the number is. Let's just say the baseline protection is $100,000, $100,000 versus your company. That's one way to look at it. If you don't protect it, it's a risk. Somebody may pick it up and run with it. If it's some very obscure thing, maybe not, but the risk is 100, 100 million or whatever that number is, right? That's the risk you're taking. Is it worth that risk?
Right. I mean, it's true. You make a good point. And I think the other thing that I would say, adding on to that, is that, yes, patents are expensive and you have to really be on top of where are we filing, why, how much is that going to cost? We're thinking about filing in many countries now, but is there going to be a pivot in the technology?
Yeah.
Is the next generation of this technology going to be much more valuable? Do I need to hold back on jurisdictions and then invest in more jurisdictions later? And then once I'm in those jurisdictions, am I constantly kind of looking at the market and my competition, what other patent applications are being filed? So I'm not just filing patents to have lots of patents, but I'm thinking about how I'm going to have defensive positions as well in a patent landscape, because that's part of the issue. And this is where some of these articles have gone that we're referring to that make a really good point that, one of the strategies behind filing patents in particular, and one of the legs of the stool of a viable IP strategy is going to be, over time, am I filing and protecting my intangible assets in a way that I'm going to have freedom to operate? Because other companies may patent in my same space, but if I have patents in the same space too, then they often will go away. Like they're not going to enforce against me because I can turn around and enforce against them. But if I'm the company, let's say, who has the best technology, but other people have occupied most of the landscape, then really I've given away my business. So it's yes, you have to file in some cases patents in order to to have that business, as you're saying. You're quite right. But it's also making sure that there is some aspect of the governance of the company that really focuses on IP governance. So that's what I really help companies with. Well, what are those processes? What is actually IP governance? And it's really sort of it's a marriage between good corporate governance and constant laser focus on intellectual property in a broad sense. Including, how am I protecting my trade secrets? How am I identifying them? How am I dealing with them in contracts? It's that full array of tools that really you require. And IP governance is just like you're looking at your budgets from a governance point of view, and you're building metrics around the success of the company in terms of, sales growth, for example, whatever it is. In an intangibles business, there should be similar and recurring and constant focus on the IP side. And, and that's what IP governance is. And that's part of the challenge that, I would say, comparatively speaking, Canadian companies don't have as singular focus on that as some of their peers in other countries right now.
So for technology companies, entrepreneurs, et cetera, how many, is there a lack of this total IP strategy governance with entrepreneurs that you're seeing in general in mining tech and other technology companies across the board?
I mean, I think it's changing. So I think there's been a bit of a shift in the last couple of years where, and I think this is sort of natural, because I think what happens is we're reaching at a stage where there are more and more of the founders of companies have done it before, right? So that sort of Silicon Valley, everybody's a serial entrepreneur. Most people have done it 2, 3, 4 times before. Like we're starting to reach that level of maturity in our ecosystem. Sure, there's gaps in it and so on and so forth, but I think there's a greater focus and understanding. Not every company. There's still companies that have like a big blind spot on these issues, and maybe it's a little bit more common here than in like Germany or UK or US and other places, Israel too. But on the other hand, I think it's shifting in a positive direction. And then the recent government programs that every startup, I hope, knows about, but there's
they don't.
Okay, all right, okay,
they don't.
Yeah, I mean, like those programs are really interesting, and so it really started with, I would say, IP Assist a number of years ago. I know you're familiar with that program, but that program gave companies a certain amount of money, but solely to focus on IP strategy. You couldn't use it on patent applications and such. But in a way, like even in our discussion, the starting point is an IP strategy. So if you want the company to elevate from an IP investment, an IP expertise point of view, that's a good place to start, to work with some experts to develop that IP strategy. So that was a good program. I think it really caused a lot of companies to understand the value that they had. And guess what? When you understand the value that you have, and I see this with companies I work with again and again, especially startups, when you develop that IP strategy, it changes the way you even pitch your business. And
Absolutely.
guess what? It's easier to raise money when you have essentially a pitch that's more focused on the real value that you have in comparison to your competitors. And so that, I think, was a good program. And then more recently, there's Elevate IP that's just now actually rolling out across the whole country, different organizations from coast to coast, administering a fair amount of money, like close to $90 million is being rolled out between now and 2026. And then we have provincial programs like IPON, for example, in Ontario. And so they're providing expertise, they're providing education, they're providing access to pretty substantial budgets that are going to increase the relative performance from an IP protection point of view in Canadian companies. And so all of that, I think, is quite positive.
In plugging those gaps, some of those gaps you mentioned before, something you said about IP strategy, I think was really important in terms of, you said something specific, protecting jurisdictions, when to pull back, when to go back in. So is it because I've run into this, somebody said you can't do that, but two things. One is that it's an ongoing, it's a process. It's an ongoing process. Not I got my patent and my renewal, and now we're going to patent there. It's no, you got to look at it all the time. It's a governance process. But also when you're going down that pathway, say you've applied for patents in this jurisdiction, then decide, well, we're not going to continue for whatever reason, you pull out. Can you go back and do that later?
Probably not.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think because in those circumstances, usually there's different ways to pull out, right? Like in a way you could, when we're looking at pruning portfolios, so part of the strategy might be to slow down how we respond. While we always want to put our best foot forward and get patents normally through as quickly as possible, maybe that you can invest less in responses, let's say, in certain jurisdictions. There are sometimes extensions of time that are available, but you have to pay for them. But ultimately, the maintenance fees, there could be certain forgiveness periods, right? That kind of thing. So every jurisdiction is a little bit different on this issue. Ultimately, you can ratchet up, ratchet down to a certain extent. But
so you've got to have diligence on this and go, as you said, it's about process. It's not just I've applied and I'm going to renew. There's a lot more to it.
Right, exactly. And this is why sort of the CPA Ontario program that's just being rolled out now, where they're focused on providing the skills that technology companies, CFOs in particular, but it bridges all industries. The goal is to make sure that those individuals who really are in charge of financial strategy, financial controls, have a broader set of understanding, including a variety of activities like fundraising, but also IP governance. And I think that's a really smart way to elevate what Canadian companies are going to be able to accomplish under leadership of those individuals. And so specifically what we're going to be talking about in that program relates to this, like what does pruning look like? But unfortunately, what I see, it's like the barrier is psychological, in my opinion, just like when I'm working with companies, because once you've invested money in a portfolio, there's something about patents where there tends to be less reluctance in shifting investment in other business areas. Something about I've invested this money and now these assets are disappearing, yet ultimately, all that matters is whether or not you're deploying money in a way that makes sense for the company. So if some things become obsolete or the market's changed or something else is more of a priority, you have to be very sanguine and unemotional in those decisions and make those shifts in your portfolio.
Which is hard for founders to do because it's very emotional about a lot of things in some cases. Some are and some aren't. But there's two other things too you mentioned, and this comes back to the strategy. It's not just about patents, is the freedom to operate. Right, because theoretically, and I'm just going to test this. Theoretically, you've got a startup, they've developed this technology, they've patented it and everything else, but they haven't looked at the know-how to, say, install and do the engineering and do the services, right, as it were, and they haven't protected it at all. So that's totally open. So is it feasible that even though they haven't done this, they've protected the asset, but they haven't protected the other part, somebody else could come in and prevent them from installing their own invention? Is that feasible?
It's possible. I mean, there's always going to be defenses to patent
Yeah.
infringement. So let's
But
say,
if you have a startup though, it's going to be hard to defend something. Like they're going to get blown out of the water by, say, a large engineering company or somebody else that stops them from doing another part of their business because they didn't think about the portfolio.
yeah, that's absolutely right. So that can happen. I mean, sometimes there's going to be defenses where somebody shows up with a patent, they want to enforce it against you, and it relates to something that you've been doing already. And that may be a defense, but the problem is if it's part of a service that you want to offer to an external party, then that may not be something that you can do.
And it could be, it depends on where in the life cycle of the company they're at. They may not be ready to provide the service, but somebody can get in there ahead of time.
Yeah.
So timing is great. Like as you said, and due diligence all the time is really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of the challenge that I see in IP is that in other financial areas of a company, when it comes to the growth of a company, it's more obvious when you need to increase spending to a certain extent, right? Because a lot of boosts in spending in areas, in a scale up in particular, it's going to be sort of revenue growth in jurisdictions. Oh, I need to invest more in sales or marketing. I need to place other people here. We're getting traction on this product. We need to scale up manufacturing, obviously. So a lot of the financial reasoning behind increases in spending in other areas are much easier to connect the dots on. Whereas in IP, I think partially what I see is that companies, as they scale, that's where you realize in hindsight, a couple of years later, that they really should have changed the focus of what they were doing around IP, or they really should have ratcheted up their investment, including to deal with freedom to operate, which you raised. And they just didn't. And in part they didn't because it's not as easy to say what's going to be the cost to the company if you don't increase your spending to deal with freedom to operate. And the answer might be, well, it depends on who these competitors are. It depends on whether or not they see you as a target. And so oftentimes what I feel is that companies say, well, this is the increase in spending it's less clear whether or not it's actually necessary. But when you look at the key thing is that I think a lot of scale ups, they're not following their competitors and their IP activities closely enough, because if they did, you can actually, at least from an IP point of view, predict an oncoming blank storm that's coming. And then, and I think you see that a lot of companies kind of miss that, right? And I think that's one of those areas where if you have good IP governance, that's something that's going to need to come up. So, here's our list of competitors in this quarter. What has their IP activity been? Because guess what? And I think that was one of the points of the article that we're referring to, because guess what? If that's a clear indicator, right? Because in a sense, like, part of competition is going to be to make sure that we at least meet what our competitors are doing. Maybe there's, you can make maybe the argument that there's a competitor that's over investing, or you don't agree with how they're investing in IP. But if there's a clear gap between what you're doing and what they're doing, that's probably something you need to look at more closely.
Now, you said about checking competitors' IP activity. Some entrepreneurs would argue that I don't have time for that. I can't afford it. It's not going to happen. I'm kind of looking at what they're doing. It's too expensive, whatever. So there's probably, I'm assuming a lot of people are thinking like that, but are you seeing a lot of companies, tech companies, that actually don't do that? Like, is it rampant, or is it kind of, it depends, or it's kind of all over the map?
I think it's all over the map. And I understand that there's so many different things competing for the time and energy and dollars of, the C-suite. But, what I would say is that because this is such an important function, every company that is innovation rich, who will need to be IP rich, and they already probably are.
That's a good I like that quote. I'm going to steal it from it. No, if you're innovation rich, you need to be IP rich. That is really cool.
100%.
I like that.
And
Yeah.
you can feel free to steal it. It's all good.
Well, you know what? I'm joking, of
I know.
course. I'll patent it tomorrow.
Yeah, so I think if you're innovation rich, then IP governance has to be a core function of your company. And that definitely means internal people who are focused on this.
Yeah.
And that's an area where I've been able to help a lot of different companies, a lot of different sectors. What does that mean in terms of their team? Is it the CTO that requires some very specific education?
Okay.
Is there somebody on the engineering team who's really good at talking to people and extracting information about what they're really working on, and they're organized, they know how to build mind maps and inventories and spreadsheets around that? And are they really good at working with their internal or outside counsel to sort of learn? Are they good at piecing together the pieces of information that are required to have an ongoing discussion around commercial strategy and how that interconnects with IP strategy? So I would say that pretty quickly, more quickly than most companies realize, they need an internal person who may not be doing that full time. They could be doing this 30% of the time initially, or 50% of the time. And so what I've seen over the years, when I think about who are those companies across sectors who've become IP stars, and starting from a point in which they had no knowledge of intellectual property, I had to do the board training around IP governance and so on, and then build it from there. Those entities that have really, really made their mark and they're actually leaders in their area, and they've increased their valuations phenomenally. They have had those smart and keen and interconnected people internally really focusing on this and then building careers out of it, right? So that's why I'm excited to teach engineering and law students about IP commercialization, because I feel that all those individuals, they're going to become embedded in various businesses, coming with skill sets that are really important. Because if, a lot of companies right now, if they want an experienced IP manager, they're having to hire from the US, because IP is expensive. You can't have every part of it handled by highly expert, outside lawyers. You need them for lots of different things, especially on the strategy side and different aspects of prosecution. But the more you can do internally, that's the big cost savings, right? And then if you can work collaboratively with your advisors to figure out what that actually means in terms of process and policies internally, then all of a sudden it's a very different proposition. And in any case, like when you have that embedded person, they are able to monitor and translate what's happening around intangible value creation in ways that no external person could ever do. Because they're at the table for business discussions, sales discussions. They involve the marketing people, because all of those functions of the company need to be pulled together to really approach this in a sort of a leading practice manner. And so that's I think the answer for lots of companies, to early on start thinking about that. Who's that person? How do we enable them? How do we facilitate their efforts?
And what you said, it's funny, on a previous podcast, we had talked about, especially in young companies, when you transition from hiring external experts to full-time, there is a transition point. You can do it externally, but when it makes sense, you've got to do, as you just said, got to do it internally. The other thing you said about the whole governance issue is it's got to be at the C-suite. One person has to be responsible, but it is a company-wide strategy. It should be part of the strategy with the C-suite, but one person has to be responsible for that. It's in their KPIs or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. And then I think the other thing, another tip that I think is really important, is that if this is a key focus of the company, and it has to be, right? And even if, let's say the advice is that patents aren't required, it's just about better governance of trade secrets and management of confidential information, selective disclosure. It could even be technological measures like encrypting certain assets, make sure that you can back up that it's only accessible on need-to-know basis, whatever it is, whatever the plan and strategy is. But the discussion of what is our plan, what's changed, what do we need to update, how are we performing, that should be a regular topic
And
on
where
the
we're
agenda.
going.
Yeah,
And
where we're going. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that needs to be on the board agenda, right? Or whatever subcommittee
Yeah.
it is, right?
Well, with a small company, it's going to be
Right.
It's going to be three people in the garage or something, right?
Right.
But they still have to think about it.
100%. And and I'll give you like a concrete example of this. Like, so a company that I'm thinking about right now that I can't name. I mean,
No, of course not.
they like mentored them. They genuinely did not initially have the money to spend, in an aggressive way on any of this, but through the mentoring and then the ongoing discussion that they had when they had the funding and they were able to convince a VC to provide extra funding, because the VC said, you need to do this. You have this strategy. Why have you not implemented it? And the company was smart. They said, well, give us extra money and we'll earmark it to that. And the VC said, fine. But then what was really important is that because of the internal discussions and the processes, which really cost them nothing, it's just something they needed to do anyways, they were ready to move. There wasn't this, now we have to figure it out and mine the detail. They had everything ready to go. So they were able to move very quickly. And then in hindsight, several years later, what we saw was that their competitor filed patents just a month or two after they did. And in really key areas, like the most important claims to control, the company ended up with, their competitor didn't, but they could have missed the mark. And it's interesting when you look at that in hindsight, but thank goodness they had those internal conversations, because then they were able to file. Otherwise, they might have missed the boat entirely. It probably would have.
And that's what you said before. The other company was probably watching what they were doing, so we better get on it, but didn't realize how far ahead they were.
That's
so
right.
Knowing what your competitors are doing is actually really important. That is cool. And again, back to the IP strategy and all this sort of stuff. Some companies don't do it, and they don't have the money or whatever it is. So they're probably taking the risk of, I can't afford it now, I'll do it later. And they're not even thinking about it. But that can actually, depending on how mature the company is, that could cause some challenges.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would argue that everybody could afford an IP strategy in some shape or form, right? Like even if so I think the big ticket items tend to be really the patents.
Yeah.
Especially if there's more than one jurisdiction, but even if you're just focused on the US or whatever it is, but also what's important to note is that, and we've got luckily these budgeting tools to make these calculations. Some of these costs, like the patent system, we're just talking about patents for a moment, it is designed with built-in deferral, right? So in a way, yes, they're very expensive, but not all the costs hit at the same time. It's sort of gradual, and you can plan for it, and so on and so forth. So those are the big ticket items. But then a lot of these other rights are less costly, including trademarks and industrial designs and things of that nature. But the strategy itself is usually going to cost maybe the equivalent of one patent application to get a really comprehensive strategy.
Risk versus reward.
100%.
Yeah.
So that's why when lots of people are saying, well, everybody needs a strategy now, it is actually true, because in a sense, you don't have, once you have the strategy, you know what to focus on, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to sort of incur these major patent expenses immediately. You have some time to do that.
Exactly. But the strategy is critical, and every company should be doing it. It was really heartening to hear one of the startups we're working with under Rethink Mining actually early on did a IP strategy, right? This is Rhino, did IP strategy right up front.
That's great.
So I was like, wow. It was like, you don't hear that. You don't normally hear that. But the other thing too, and another immature, not really a startup, had related a story to us about not the right strategy, because it was the other intangible assets versus the widget or whatever it is. And it was related to people and the IP, the intangible assets that walked out the door, the people.
Yeah.
Because again, having that right strategy, having the right agreements in place when you hire, and with companies as they grow, the people are going to change.
Yeah.
And you got to be very careful that stuff doesn't walk out the door.
Right. Well, and that's really important, because I mean, part of the lens when you're looking at this from the point of view, okay, we need to sort out what a credible IP strategy looks like for this company for now and for the future. You're also going to look at it through the lens of what are investors going to focus on, right? Yeah. And investors are they don't usually, it depends on the industry. Life science is an exception where if you don't have your patent house in order, like forget it. But in most other industries, investors aren't going to walk away because they feel the company could have filed more patents or better patents or whatever it is. But if there isn't clear chain of title when it comes to the key intangible assets, then you have a real problem on your hands. And chain of title is really about, what are these intangible assets, who contributed to them, and what are the legal rights that the company has to either own, control, or use those assets. So, if you are a company where one of your key intangible assets was developed at university, like what contracts are in place there, which happens a lot everywhere. And every university is a little bit different and so on and so forth, but you need to kind of get a hold of that, and if there are gaps, you need better to address them sooner rather than later. And certainly doesn't help to ignore it, right? Because it's, maybe nobody's raising it as issue now, but they will eventually, because, whether it may not come up in your first round, because a lot of times it depends on what's the lens through which the VC looks at the value of the company. But usually what you find is that sometimes a company will escape that level of scrutiny on their first raise, and then they think, oh, okay, we're good. And then on the next raise, very different approach to due diligence, where they want to look back to the very beginning. And then the other factors that come in is, these material contributors to key technologies in this company, what were their employment obligations? Were they limelighting? How strong are the employment contracts? Classic is that, the C-suite never signed an employment contract, but people after a while did. That happens quite a bit. And maybe somebody's left, so on and so forth. So these are pretty simple things to take care of, but you have to kind of keep taking care of them over the time. So part of the value of the IP strategy is going to look at this, it's going to look at the use of open source, open data. What are the practices around that? So there's a whole host of issues that, will be covered. And even if it's at a high level, it really will shift or focus the attention of the company on some of these things sooner rather than later. And that's really key to the success of the company.
And we all know that open source isn't really open source. There are agreements and license, GPL 3 or 4 or wherever it is now, those sort of things. There's lawsuits related to open source. So it's not free and easy. And a lot of people don't understand. I'll download it, I'll put it in my product. Well, hold on. That's not quite how it works.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, like everybody, so the commercial reality is that almost every company is using open source. The question is, are they managing their use of open source such that they are limiting or mitigating some of the risks? And usually a classic example is that there could be the very same open source package that's subject to 2 different licenses. One license has really pernicious effects, another one doesn't. And the other thing is, it's not just about whether or not you're using open source and what the applicable legal terms and conditions are, but it's also how does that use of open source relate to your technology as a whole, including the proprietary components. Because in some cases, you can really insulate the effects. But if you're not managing it, you're not thinking ahead around these issues, it can become a problem. Like it's still usually a fixable problem, to be candid, because you can sort of remediate, whether it means like recoding certain elements or changing the structure of the software or whatever the technology is. So there are ways to deal with it. But the problem is that if the due diligence focuses on this, and this is so easy to do now with technology, these platforms where you just scan the code and the degree of granular detail around everything that's been used at the problems, depending on the licenses and so on, it's really quite amazing. And so I would say because of that technology, it's become more of a due diligence issue. And so companies have to be prepared on this.
But it comes back to what you said before. You've got to understand what you're doing, do your due diligence, and move forward the right way, whether you're patenting yourself or IP protection or whatever it is, but also something else.
Right.
I related in a previous podcast about a lawsuit I was involved in years ago with a software firm that was using some open source, and
my condolences.
Yeah, well, I was just a technical person in the background. People had asked for advice on stuff, which I didn't know much about, honestly. But what came out of that was basically the change of the code. Like a 20% code means it's no longer like enough, whatever percentage we've modified it enough. It's no longer relevant, right? Or less relevant and whatever. So anyway, there's a lot of cool things there. What you said, I want to dive into this a little bit because I think it's really important, is a chain of title, right? Because, you mentioned universities, but these days, and one of the startups we were talking about earlier is using technology from multiple industries, multiple companies. And it's a matter of, if you could dive into a little bit about what do you mean by chain of title,
Right.
and what level of, what degree of ownership control, it's about control, not ownership, I believe, right?
It depends. Yeah.
It depends. What is that? How important is that? Because we're running into that one of our consortia where it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And then, so the chain part of chain of title, what that really implies is that, there's going to be multiple contributors, multiple sources of the contributions to technology or the technology itself. Because as you say, there could be third-party technology. So my intangible assets may be built upon third-party platforms, third-party data, third-party software. Maybe really my intangible value is certain customized components that operate alongside those things. Maybe it's derivative data or insights, but I still have to worry about the underlying data. So it's usually their intangible assets are a bit of a hodgepodge of different assets mixed together. That's not unusual, right? And I think to have a valuable company, it's not like you need to create everything from scratch. So, it's in fact, speed is so important that leveraging and other assets and not reinventing the wheel unless you need to is really important. But because of all of that, though, you really have to, at the end of the day, look at the most important intangible assets and kind of look at, okay, who owns these, who controls them, who contributed to them. And the chain part is important because, there's this principle under the law that, you can't give what you don't have. So I can have all these assignments, and there can be complicated corporate structures, not just sort of university direct to the startup, but as you know, it could be university, some spin-off who did a license to another company who further developed it, and then maybe they sold certain assets to someone else, right? So it can be a bit of a convoluted story, but all along the way, you have to be able to track ownership in the sense of each party in that chain had the actual ability to grant those rights, whether it's the ownership or the control or the use through a license or something like that. And so that's really what we mean, where we don't just care about, the last person or company who assigned or licensed certain assets. We do have to go back to the very inception, and there's exceptions to that. And frankly, like yesterday, I was talking to a company where they have a messy situation and they were very concerned about, because there's like a bankruptcy in between and different things that. So there are going to be complicated stories, and investors are used to complicated stories from startups, especially. But what is important, and it's good that this company is sort of reaching out at this time, is, you have to have a plan on how you're going to explain it to investors at the very least, and also some kind of a plan that's credible on how you're going to fix it. At least over time. Right. And so that's what's important. So what I find sometimes is that there's a bit of avoidance in startups around some of these issues, and the problems just become more severe over time and more costly to correct. And
it becomes more dangerous as you're moving technology forward, because you may be stopped and you can't do anything else with it, lose the company, lose whatever, be sued. There's all sorts of negative impacts if you do that. And it's funny, I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago who said, we don't want to put too much burden on the startup and all this stuff. And my comment back was, well, they're not going to be able to go forward because you don't have that chain of title. Like you can't do it. It's gonna stop them from going anywhere else.
Right. Well, and I think it's important to mention that, like where we've been focused on investors, but in a way, the sort of the enterprise partners, the corporate partners that you're going to need to validate your technologies and pay for pilots and eventually become your customers. They're just as important, and they may not always do the due diligence on these matters, but they tend to, because they're typically they're making a big investment too. So they don't want to pour a lot of their resources, money into a particular project when there could have been an alternative, and there tends to be an alternative. if they end up dealing with a company where they didn't have their house in order, because then there's going to be problems around that. Because if the company doesn't own or control these assets the way they need to, then they can't pass on the necessary ownership and control to their customers either. And of course, as you know, like there's going to be reps and warranties, maybe not right away around these issues, but there will be downstream. And then if it turns out that there's a gap, somebody comes out of the woodwork, then not only is the company maybe on the hook to indemnify, let's say, its customer or its collaboration partner, but in addition to that, they'll lose their customer, right? And that can be very painful, particularly at early stages, if it's sort of a key partner or reference customer.
And you could potentially have a competitor who finds this out and says, oh, they don't have control or ownership. I'm going to do a deal and take off and build something better, faster, cheaper, whatever, right? There's lots of dangers of not having that chain of title. And in that sense, I want to get into the funding side of things, because I'm not sure everybody really understands, some of the people, companies, startups we've talked to, how important this is when you're going for future investment, right? Not just the chain of title, but even the corporate structure. If there's two, it's got to be relatively simple, but what that sort of looks like, that chain of title, and how important that is when you're going into investment, like the chain of title, the control, the ownership, and this sort of thing. Especially, you mentioned earlier, Anthony, that there may be less due diligence in earlier rounds, like seed, pre-seed, whatever. When you get into the Series A and B, we're going all the way back and follow that. But how important is that chain of title and complication of structures when startups are ready for, or any company is ready for, larger investments?
Yeah, I mean that's very true. So yeah, the chain of title issue, and just to sort of maybe add to the earlier discussion, that also includes all of the employees and what their contracts have to say, right? And I think one of the things that we need to mention is that the law has been changing in the employment area, as you know, in lots of different ways, in lots of different jurisdictions, but including around this issue of, if you don't have explicit IP assignment provisions, waivers of moral rights, and different things, does the company actually own those important technological contributions of the employee? And it's harder, in fact, to make that argument that they do in that absence now than it was before, right? And so a lot of factors such as this employee, were they hired to invent, were they not hired to invent, will play in, and you don't want that uncertainty. And I think it's very typical in the mining sector, but in other sectors too, where Canadian companies also are innovating across borders, right? So they're hiring people wherever they find them, in the US, Latin America,
or outsourcing elsewhere, right? It happens a lot, right?
100%. So you have to address all of that. And so, I would say that when it comes to investment, they're not going to be necessarily exhaustive. Typically, I think what happens in deals is that, the investor will look very quickly at what they consider to be the key material technological assets. It may not necessarily be what the company thinks their key assets are.
And what the risk tolerance too, right?
Yeah, 100%. And then so what they're going to come up with, their own determination of that, and then they're going to look at it through the lens of, okay, so this particular, let's say, subset of the technology stack, or these key intangible assets, like who really drove this, who contributed to it. And then oftentimes, you can imagine, in many companies, once that's determined, people have come and left and so on and so forth, and then it may be that there was a good template at some point that had all these clauses, but then they stopped using it for some reason, almost like a word processing error. And then, we have to deal with what that looks like, and how we kind of correct it to the extent that we can, or construct a narrative to present to the investor on why this isn't really a substantial threat. But the challenge there is that, it's going to impact on valuation for sure if there are these gaps. And then the flip side of it, I would say, is that because it's easy to protect against, sometimes the investors, they shift their view of how capable this team is. Because if they're not taking care of this key function, like what else is there that is not being taken care of that they can't necessarily see, right? So I think that's why these issues are so important.
And it comes up to three key things: IP strategy, and basically, right?
Yep.
Because this circles back to the conversation we had about freedom to operate, people, and all that stuff, and even employment has to make sure that the companies and the executive are thinking about these things.
Yeah, 100%. So that's that key part of the chain of title that we can't forget. And then, yeah, and as you said earlier, like I think as the round becomes bigger,
yes,
and that obviously means that the valuation of the company is higher, which also means that presumably the company is further along from a commercialization point of view. For all of those reasons, there's going to be more scrutiny and more attention paid to this, and if the gaps are there, then there's going to be a higher price to pay for those gaps. Yeah.
So in situations, and this is kind of where what Rethink Mining does, CMIC does, is we put together a consortia to co-develop technology with customers from startups or OEMs or somebody else. We borrowed that model from other industries. Software is famous for this sort of, other industries have been doing it for a long time. So IP, as it relates to when you're doing these consortia sort of approaches, do you have is there anything special, different things that we have or others have to be mindful of, whether you're the tech company or you're the mining company, it's us? How does that change if you're doing this type of approach?
Yeah, good question. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Could be a long answer. I don't know. I'll try to.
Well, you've done this with other industries too.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think the starting point is that each party is going to need to do their homework on what are they really bringing to the table, and they have to, before they even engage in the collaboration, in my view, think about what are the likely contributions by the other parties, and also what are the risks that could present from the intermingling of this intellectual property, either in terms of maybe sort of dissemination of information where essentially my IP is leaking to your IP or vice versa, creating uncertainty around ownership, interfering with my IP strategy as it relates perhaps to that specific set of intangible assets already. But then you have to look at the benefits of the collaboration as well, right? So a lot of times like these collaborations occur where, the commercialization strategy isn't clear yet. There's sharing of costs and risks around testing some of these
early
theories.
stages.
100%. Because it's at an early stage, I think in a way, while there may be certain risks, the reality is that those risks are really mitigated, or can be mitigated through how it is that we manage IP, what the contracts actually say. And also, I think in those types of collaborations, what's really important is not just to have your initial risk analysis and set of interests that you're going to use to negotiate the collaboration agreement. And if you can't meet those interests, then maybe you're going to need to modify how you're involved or whether you want to be involved. But also, I think it's important to schedule retests, if you will, of those interests, because these collaborations, they pivot, they change.
Yes.
And the sort of the risk landscape changes.
And the technology change as it gets more mature, the risk is higher, the inputs are higher, the more due diligence can be required, et cetera.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And then I think, and then there has to be sort of agreement on like who's actually going to, in a sense, be the steward for some of these assets for the benefit of all of the parties potentially, or a subset of the parties. And this is why the CMIC model, I think, is interesting and maybe not unique in the world, but it's quite unique. It's quite unique
in mining.
Unique in mining. And it's a good model because in a sense, like I think, and you see this in other consortia as well. Like it may be that there's an independent party, which is probably, that's going to obviously generate more trust. Let's call it like a senior lead party that is willing to commit to certain ethical standards, even of how they're going to manage these issues. Because a lot of times it's easy to forget that, in these collaborations, the contract is critical. The underlying overall IP strategy is critical, and the sub strategies of the parties, and how making sure there's not too much friction between the two, but also hopefully there is, history between these parties. There's trust between these parties. There's and governance structure.
Yeah.
So if these issues pop up, there's going to be a discussion, and then there's at least some people at the table who can resolve issues before they become big issues. Because there's a lot of litigation related to technology collaborations. I mean, not all of it necessarily makes its way to court, but I think if you structure the contracts and the relationships correctly, you could really significantly reduce that risk.
Yeah. And that comes down to two things too. In a realization I have is that agreements that have been used in the past by us with mining companies and others were more consortium, collaborative, trusting agreements, and others are now more contractual, almost procurement type of agreements because not everybody's worked together before. It's new territory, so it's actually a lot more rigor than people who have already done that. And have you seen this sort of thing as well, where it's a little less structured versus really highly structured, more like we're going to buy your stuff?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there is that trend for sure, but also I would say that when you look at a particular technology, there tends to be evolution of the contractual approach, right? Like depending on how early stage it is.
Yeah. Well, that's the sort of thing we do too, right? We start with a simple agreement and then try and ratchet it up. And we're in most cases we're now at, because you don't know it's going to keep going, and you got to build the trust and build all that stuff and see where you're going to go next. Something that was very interesting in this is you talked about bankruptcy and chain of title and everything else. But there's something relevant to that I think is important. This comes back to the first question about intellectual property rights, because they're two different. My understanding is two different things, right? Is that, and this is coming from our mining companies. So mining companies are very clear that if the startup goes bankrupt, or if they sell, right? And you've seen this in some of our agreements. If they're bankrupt or sold, they still want access to the intellectual property. So if it's bankrupt, that's potentially in a situation of orphaned IP, depending on how mature the company is. If there's no VCs involved, if there could be tentacles into ownership there. Mm-hmm. But how do you deal with the intellectual property rights in those two cases? One where it's bought by a third party. The company is bought, or pieces of it, or a piece of the tech stack is bought, or whatever. And the second one, which is probably more challenging, is if the IP is potentially orphaned. Mm-hmm. And I have a third question for that too, after we talk with these two.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, like bankruptcy and how it relates to intellectual property law and intangible rights more generally, it's very complicated. And there are a lot of things that, you can draft the best terms in the agreement.
Yeah.
But ultimately there can still be a risk that you lose the access that you want or need. But generally speaking, in collaboration agreements, there are a number of ways to reduce that risk. And part of it is, that you want to perfect certain rights. For example, you have certain licenses in place already that would need to be honored in those circumstances typically. Now, even there could be some risk potentially, but then depending on the interests involved, if some of these licenses were threatened, then you might have to take certain legal steps to protect those rights. And then, of course, like similar to the concept of source code escrow, you effectively can draft terms that don't necessarily, let's say, confirm certain existing licenses already, but in certain circumstances, there's access provided in a contract in other ways that provide that kind of continuity of certain benefits to companies who invested their resources in creating the technology. So there's some of those measures. Another key measure is really in some of these collaboration agreements, there are rights to monitor the financial viability of the company, which I think is really quite important, right? And so I think there is an opportunity to be very thoughtful of what that means in these circumstances for this company, and also for the interests of usually the collaborators who are larger companies. So what are the specific reports that they want to see? Maybe there's observer status on the board of the company, let's say. There's lots of different ways from a corporate governance point of view to reduce some of those risks.
Yeah. And those risks in terms of like bankruptcy or rights to monitor financial, that may change as things move on, right? You start early stages, small investments, they're escalating. It's like, we're not sure this is going to take off. Can you do this?
Yeah.
Or are we supporting the company?
Right. 100%.
Versus the technology. There's two different things. Right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think like ultimately, like I think these typically the companies that do these types of collaborations are pretty sophisticated. And so, and they understand that at the end of the day, these are relatively high risk investments. So I think, again, like just on so many of the things we've been talking about today, as you invest more money or the technology becomes higher value to each collaborator, you may want to change your approach, right? So before you put more money in, you're like, okay, now here's the approach we're going to take to this as of today, right? And ratchet up some of these protections as you go.
And when you're doing the co-development where the customers are, which is what we're doing, customers are paying for it, right? The way I look at this is they're essentially the investors, right? They're the pre-seed or seed investors, probably not Series A because that's a lot of money, but that's the way to look at it. Right?
That's right.
That's the way I see it, and I'm not sure all the companies see it that way.
Yep. And also there may be an argument for some technologies to be jointly owned, which provides, maybe some extra protection in those circumstances. So there's a lot of ways in which we could alleviate these issues.
Well, you said one thing too about when you're doing the co-development consortia sort of thing is in the co-development piece is trusted third party. And again, this is the sort of things we do. So in the case of, and it's just theoretical, and again, we're thinking about this, and I think we may have talked about this, but I think it's something that one of our mining company members have mentioned, is that in the event that there's a bankruptcy, like in agreements and stuff like this, in the event that there's a bankruptcy and there's no liens or whatever terms are on the intellectual property, is it viable or even feasible to have that IP? And I don't know the difference between owned and vested into a third party for a period of time. And if they reboot or whatever, there's conditions around that. So it sits somewhere else and doesn't disappear, right? Because it could basically get shelled and gone. And miners have put in millions of dollars in this stuff. Is something like that viable at all?
It may be. I mean, it depends on the circumstances for sure, but it could be. And I think also it's important, I think, to mention that when we look at these bankruptcies, what tends to happen is, there is a professional receiver who's in place, and their obligation is to try to do the best job that they can to, recover as much value or protect as much value as possible. And so, you can imagine in this situation, one of their first conversations is going to be with these other companies that are invested in the technology to see what can be accomplished, right? So it's relatively rare that you see this sinkhole of value and then it's gone. You know what I mean? Like what tends to happen is conversations around how access maybe for certain royalties. It may very well be the best way to salvage some of the situation. And so that's typically what's going to happen. And I think that's where some of this monitoring really becomes critical, not just to sort of know where the company's at, but to have advance notice where, there's probably a receiver who's going to be appointed. So I think that's why in particular, those are pretty important protections.
Yeah, cool. No, I want to test that because we're always thinking our mining company partners are always asking, why don't you do this? One legal counsel from the company said, why doesn't the IP just sit with CMIC from day one, Rethink Mining from day one, right? So these things and that has happened in the past, right? One of the agreements you wrote, it vested with us on behalf of the consortium. So in the event of bankruptcy, could you do that? But again, I just thought I'd raise it 'cause we're trying to look at things differently.
Right. So, well, and I think that's why I sort of mentioned steward earlier. Like I think it's common in a consortium for somebody to be a steward in part for those reasons. Yeah. And then I think it could be that like what sometimes I find is that these agreements don't play around sufficiently with concepts of joint ownership or partial assignments of IP and also in a sense, like from the company's point of view, it's very important for them to own IP because otherwise they can't get invested. But on the other hand, if they're sometimes there's lots of ways to achieve a compromise that meets everybody's objectives. And sometimes not all the options are discussed. Like one thing that comes to mind is that, the intellectual property continues to be developed over time. But to protect the interests, let's say, of the mining companies, maybe they don't need the latest version of it.
Yeah.
But if in a way they have access to the previous version of it, across the different phases of development, that might be, a good foundation to achieve a good compromise around some of these issues. So there's lots of ways in which to slice and dice these issues. And in CMIC's case, like possibly like joint ownership of certain core assets might be interesting to protect against some of these eventualities.
Something to think about. Anyway, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions in terms of advice. So no, you've already strategy, right? Other than that, if you're a like any words of wisdom, if you're a startup or technology company that is whatever, if you gave them any words of advice, what would that be? Aside from IP strategy, because we already made that point 12 times.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of pay attention to all of the different types of formal intellectual property. So be thoughtful around branding strategy. So I think mining isn't always a brand conscious area, but I would say when it comes to startups, especially, to get their technology noticed, including by mining companies, it helps to have a good branding strategy, right? And because in a way, it's a lot easier to spread the word about a company if there's a brand that makes sense. And so don't forget about brands. Don't forget about trademarks at the appropriate time. And what's neat about trademarks, I would say, is that there isn't that same urgency that there is with patents, because if you disclose and you don't file within a year in Canada, US, for example, then you're done. You've lost the asset. Trademarks you can take your time with. So pay attention to that. And then the other thing that I think people oftentimes, I would say that they are focusing on trade secrets rather than patents. But when you dig beneath it, it's just there's a laziness attached to that statement. So pay attention to what of your technology can actually operate as a trade secret, because you know that your competitors aren't going to be able to come up with the same thing within some specific period of time, let's say, that makes sense. And so be thoughtful around that patent versus trade secrets dichotomy for your business. And then if there are trade secrets, which there always are, then just pay attention to how it is that you're protecting them, because the laws around the ability of a company to actually enforce its trade secrets through breach of confidence cases, for example, in Canada, it's not what startups or even sophisticated companies expect. But even if they educated themselves around the need to be able to identify these things, the need to show that you treated those particular information assets differently from more standard, less valuable assets, your care in your contracts, your practices around disclosure or selective disclosure. So those are all things that I find that even companies that have pretty healthy patent budgets tend not to pay attention to enough. They don't have enough business process and governance around it. And there's really no excuse. So don't forget about those assets in particular.
And in the case of where we're sitting and with mining companies, so what I'm seeing when I started in CMIC, the startups and entrepreneurs weren't on the radar of most mining companies. Again, there's probably some that were dealing with them. That's escalated significantly, right? A lot. A discussion we had in New Jersey at New Lab, I think I introduced you to New Lab, was the startups were saying, well, it's too hard to work with you. And the miners were basically saying, we're trying to change our processes to be more friendly to you. So in the case of mining companies that are working more with tech companies in early stages, are there any words of advice for them in this space? Because it's not necessary, it's relatively new.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I would say that particularly, if you look at some of these studies that we've been talking about, like mining innovation is increasing. There's this digital bent to it. There's increasingly an automation focus to it. And these are technology areas where mining companies just can't, do it on their own.
No.
I mean, they really do benefit from collaboration, all the other parts of mining innovation, but this is a special area where, they probably need to be a bit more open and a bit easier to deal with, in particular, because sometimes these companies that mining companies want the tech companies, the mining companies want the tech companies to focus on this sector. And sometimes the mining sector is competing for attention with other sectors.
Oh, God, yeah.
So if the perception is that mining is hard to commercialize with, then these companies are not going to focus on mining. And that's not what the mining industry wants or needs, right? So I think there are these sort of best practices, and I think it's sort of how reasonable you are around certain points in these contracts is one thing. But what's even more important is the culture that's projected by the companies. So how transparent is your approach? Like, your approach is your approach. Like, every company is going to have certain red flags or no-go situations from a risk point of view, whether it's indemnification or whatever it is, their particular approach around liability. But what really frustrates, I think, innovative companies is when they end up spending a lot of or wasting a lot of time trying to come up with a deal. So to the extent that mining companies can be clear about, here is our template agreement, and possibly even put on a website, this is usually what we use. We're open to doing other things. This is our approach. These are our timelines. This is how we make decisions around. The other industries have done this, like life sciences in particular. Sometimes it's not codified. So, for example, the secret of success, for example, in the Swiss pharmaceutical industry is, it's just, that's the way they do business. Like, things are clear, things are pretty streamlined. And so the more mining companies can emulate some of those approaches, I think the perception is going to be that they're great to work with. And I sometimes I find in the mining industry, companies actually are really great to work with, but that perception is not getting into the technology industry.
And that's what we heard specifically around that table in New Jersey was, no, that's not perception. That's not how we do it. That's not what we're seeing, the codification sort of thing. And it's funny, what you just said was raised by somebody on a previous podcast about how we do tech development in software with the mining industry. So what you said, exactly the same thing. It's nice to see from the legal and the tech development perspective. But you said something really important, too, is culture. Right? Like, all the paper is important, right? It's all important. But if you're going to do these things, there has got to be a trusting related, I'd like to say innovation happens at the speed of trust. These things happen. Business is built on the speed of trust, or on trust. That comes into it as well.
Yeah.
And what I like to tell folks as well is that what happens is a lot of the startups, and there's a misunderstanding, I think, is that they go to procurement. Not a good place. Procurement's a vehicle, right? It's nothing more than a vehicle to do the paperwork. Go somewhere else, says, yes, make it happen. Here's the agreement, go. But as you said, codified and put up there. I do know a couple of mining companies are putting up, here's our principles of operating with you, which is nice. They're recognizing this, they're changing, which is really nice. But it comes down to how you do it in practice, which is more challenging, and it makes it easier too when you have a steward that can be in the middle and do all of this stuff 100%. For them, right?
But as a steward, partially what you're doing is you're vouching for what it's like to work for particular companies, right? So every company is going to be different. We're talking about some companies that are really large, so how they sort of behave in certain types of collaborations may not be the same in others, right? So you're kind of pulling people together. You're advocating for the right type of governance related to the project. So in a way that really helps everybody. That level sets expectations as well.
And the other interesting thing we did, which it just dawned on me when I was talking to this entrepreneur from the States, is that we negotiated the procurement agreement. So when it was ready for this large mining company to make an investment, we just tack on the project agreement. Done. The startup didn't have to touch the procurement. Done. done. So we did that, and it was painful, but it was done.
Yeah.
Now we've built that relationship. Last point is, again, the mining industry hasn't collaborated as much as it's ramping that up. It is ramping up, and we're seeing a lot of that. A lot of companies are now working with each other. 10 years ago, it was like pulling teeth. It was really tough. So as these mining companies are going into collaborative efforts to build technology, whether it's between 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever, is there any advice on the collaboration side that you haven't touched on previously when they're doing it themselves?
Yeah, and so, but they're finding partners themselves, I'm assuming,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think what comes to mind for me is that ultimately, when I look at whether it's in sector A or sector B, when you look at the companies that are really, really successful when it comes to collaborative development, and let's keep in mind that because of the complexity of technology
yeah,
and bringing technologies to market, more and more technologies are entering the market through
yeah,
collaborations than ever
yeah,
before. It's a people business,
yeah,
right? So I
yeah,
think like the easiest answer to that, Carl, is like just be very thoughtful around who you're putting, into a role when it comes to
yeah,
tracking, advocating for a particular partnership within the company, managing it. And you have to select that person not just based on what the corporation wants to accomplish, what your technological goals are, but also whom they're going to be interfacing with, like
yeah,
whether it's on the startup side, the OEM side, or the other mining company side. So finding that right mix of people who can work together effectively
yeah,
is really ultimately what's most important. The contracts could say whatever they want. The technology will do what it does. But and those factors. I mean, obviously you can control the contract, but the contract without people working together effectively is meaningless.
yeah,
And so I think that's that sort of HR function, that talent function. If it's important to the company, making sure that the people who are managing these partnerships are given the training, the experience, the mentorship,
yeah,
and the support at the C level
yeah,
that they really require, and also even really as a company setting some internal service levels when it
yeah,
comes to making decisions related to these collaborations, because that's where things tend to get
yeah,
off track.
yeah. Well, it's also too understanding. We spoke about this before. Understanding what are we trying to achieve, agree on that first, and paper it after. If you try and paper it, then you'll get lost in the paper without understanding what you're trying to do.
Right.
Right.
And also like making sure that the processes are in place, where sometimes what I find is that companies will enter into collaborations with the best of intentions
Yeah.
and really a lot of diligence around why they're doing it and what their expectations are. But then the ground shifts,
Yep.
right? And so in order to, especially to sort of maintain that reputation that you need, honesty is always the best policy. So
Yeah.
if the ground shifted and a decision's been made internally that this isn't a priority anymore, best to deal with it and communicate
Yep.
it to the parties. I see that a lot in collaborations
Yeah.
where, you're wondering whether the commitment's there, and then you find out that sure enough, the commitment hasn't been there for 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is. And that becomes a problem.
Yeah.
And it also becomes more of a risk and liability to the company,
Yeah.
because it makes it more likely that counterparties are going to become frustrated. One of the reasons why people are hesitant sometimes to enter into these relationships is because they're worried about lawsuits potentially. But I think it's some of those corporate behaviors that
Yeah.
that increase the risk of those things.
Yeah.
So it's just better to make sure that you're not just managing decision making, but the communication of those decisions to your partners.
And even anti-competition has come up a few times. Some companies are worried about that, but if it's pre-commercial, it's not really competitive. But something you said was really important is that commitment and that sort of stuff. In one of our consortia, we were hearing individually that, oh, we're not really there. We're gonna leave, like all this stuff. There's one-on-one conversation. So in one of the meetings that was minuted, I'm going to go around the table and ask you, are you in or out?
Yeah.
Right? Because we heard it. So you got to go in there and you've got to paper it. You've got to paper that and make sure that commitment is there.
Yeah.
So having that third party in the middle, understanding all this stuff and trying to put their arms around chaos is actually pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't quite truthful. I said I had 3 questions. I have 12, but I have one more.
Sure.
it's really important. And again, I used to say I'm not from mining, but I've worked with other industries in the past. You do this. You work with fintech and pharma and all sorts of industries. I'm assuming many others as well. Compared to mining, how are we doing in terms of what we're, the tech development and all this sort of stuff, working with startups? Do you have any opinion on that? And we can take it out later if you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's less, I would say, industries and rather parts of industries that are able, for whatever reason, to facilitate the cultural change around really wanting to embrace rapid deployment of technology, right? And I think there's a whole bunch of structural reasons why maybe that's not happening in mining as quickly as it is in other industries, perhaps.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think a lot of it's about money, right? There's there's a lot of money in mining, but also there are tremendous costs and they're increasing costs.
Yes.
And we're seeing this across the economy. So driving cultural change and increasing investment in technology when the cost of everything else is going up, like maybe not exponentially, but a lot, is a challenge, right? Yeah. And so I think it requires almost like an extremely like extreme devotion to finding the resources and channeling the resources into innovation right now. And then there's some industries that are better able to sustain that than others. I think that's kind of what it boils down to right now in the current environment.
Which makes collaborating to reduce the risk, reduce the cost more important, which we're actually seeing, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So this is Anthony. This was really, we could go for, I think, a lot. I got more pages of stuff, but we're unfortunately don't have a lot of time. Thank you. This has been really cool.
You're very welcome.
And it's been really interesting. I thought I knew a lot of this stuff, but I didn't. So I learned quite a bit here today. Thanks. Thank you for tuning into Source. We hope you'll learn some valuable insights and really cool information about the mining industry and especially how it impacts our lives every single day. You want to stay tuned to what we're up to and the really cool innovations that are going on every single day? Connect with us on our social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, or at our website, rethinkmining.org. Until next time, catch you later.